Hey, beauty friends, it's me. It's Meredith from Beadalon. Hello and welcome to another wonderful, fantastic class for the Michaels Community Classroom. I'm Meredith Roddy from Beadalon and Artistic Wire. And today's class, we are going to be making, it's called jewelry. What is the name of our class today? Felicia, remind me.
It is jewelry making with Meredith Roddy.
Jewelry making with Meredith Roddy, but what the jewelry that we are making is this beautiful, very fancy or deceptively fancy pearl strand that uses magnets to hold it together. So we're going to talk a lot about wire, about jewelry construction, about making things, about putting together a really kind of fun and funky, fancy looking piece of jewelry for the very affordable price of beads that you can find at Michael's. So just a quick introduction. Beadalon is the manufacturer of the jewelry making wire that we are using today for class. And we are so happy and so honored and delighted to have been a part of the Michaels Community Classroom for so long, and we continue to do so. And I'm just very happy to be here with you today. You can tell I'm really jazzed up about this class. So I think without further ado, Felicia, we can go ahead and take that overhead camera. I just need to do another quick adjustment, and then we can go ahead and go through everything that we need to do for class today. I'm just going to minimize my screen here and open up the instructions that were included with the class link. And then, of course, if you are joining us live, please feel free in the comments to ask any questions, ask me to clarify anything that I haven't quite gone over effectively enough. And then if you're watching the replay, please feel free to check those instructions in the comments section. Hello, everybody, and welcome. I like to keep my classes pretty casual, so please feel free to be in those comments and let me know if there's anything else that I might not have touched on that you have a question about as well. So you can see here, I'm kind of playing around with this design a little bit, and I really like it. It is a one strand design. Did a little dangle do here on the end. I couldn't help myself. If those of you who know me know that I can't help but put a little dangle do in. And the way that I have these magnetic beads aligned in my design, try to line them up on my fingers as well, means that I don't have a clasp here. The magnets just keep this design together on my wrist. I made this design long enough so it can actually be a necklace as well. And then those magnetic beads, which are of course going to stick to each other through this whole class today, but that's okay. Those magnetic beads can wrap over or can keep that necklace in a long form or in a shorter form. You could do it as a choker with a couple of dangles coming down this way. So a lot of different possibilities in one design. I just really liked how those magnetic beads added a different design element. We do a lot of stringing. We do a lot of different putting together of the beads from the beautiful bead wall at Michael's here on our Michael's classes. But I thought to try something a little bit different today. Take these magnetic beads, play around with them a little bit, and see what our possibilities are. A couple of things just to remember right off the bat is different wrists and different people are different sizes, right? So as I mentioned in the instructions, if your wrist is a little bit larger or a little bit smaller than mine, you're going to have to kind of play around with your counts. What worked best for me was a count of 7 pearls, and I'm going to go over all the materials in just a second. 7 pearls in between each of my hematite beads, but for you, 6 pearls in between your hematite beads might be the right one. For others, 9 or 10 beads in between the hematite beads, 9 to 10 pearls, I should say, might be your sweet spot. So just keep in mind that oftentimes in jewelry making, counting and counts make a big difference for repeats and for sizing. And sometimes there isn't, sometimes there is just, a tried and true, this is how many beads you need, and this is how you're going to do it. But sometimes you have to play around with it. And I find that the playing around with it often leads to even more discoveries and even more ways of using my materials. So I try never to be frustrated by having to take something apart and recount it and redo it again. And for this bracelet, I actually did have to do that. I had to redo my counts a couple of times. The other thing right off the bat is you want to really look at your tension. And I'm going to come back to this, but I wanted to kind of just give a little introduction as we're going along. Your tension is going to play a really big role in this design. I tried to put in as much wiggle room and as much leeway in this design as possible before I finished it off. And I could use even a little bit more. Because what ends up happening is these beads, this wire is fighting the beads. It's not laying the way I want it to. It does off of my wrist. It's perfectly wonderful when I want to take a picture of it. But when I put this design onto my wrist, it's fighting me a little bit. So when we're designing our jewelry, we always want to think about our materials and how we can build our designs so that it does what we want it to do. Because in wearing this bracelet, it's going to constantly be flapping this way because my wire is too tight. And I kept it this way to be able to explain why that's important and why building wiggle room and building suppleness into your designs is important. Oftentimes, I did this myself all the time. When I first started beading, I would string my designs too tight and they would either snap or they would end up stretching. It's not actually stretching, it's because the wire is under tension and so it untwists. All of these different things are what you come to do as second nature when you work at a wire factory for 17 years. But even in making this design, when I finished it, I was like, great, I have everything closed and everything is as it should be. And I crimped it, but I didn't do it on my wrist. And so what ends up happening is you can see here, this wire wants to fling out. So we're going to kind of work through some of those issues as we're doing our stringing today. And Susie has a wonderful, wonderful point in the comments. She says, working from the spool, like you stated in the instructions, will make playing around very easy without wasting materials. Yes, exactly. And I almost always work from the spool when I am doing my beading, whether it is using bead stringing wire like I have right here, or if I am using sort of a big old spool of wire here, if I'm using copper wire as well, working from the spool really helps minimize waste. And it's a habit that I've gotten into and it makes for a much better project, which is why in the instructions, I don't say something like pull off 6 feet of wire, because who wants to work with 6 feet of wire? It's much, much easier to take a little bit off the spool, replace the clip, or if you have a spool tamer, you can use a spool tamer on your wire, but it just makes it a lot easier. Okay, so let's talk about our materials for our project today. So we're going to use some 49 strand wire. And I'm using 49 strand because I want this bracelet to be as supple and as string-like as possible. Could I put this on a piece of silk? Probably. Could I put this on like a dandelion or a wildfire thread? I think that might work also. But when I'm making bracelets, I tend to use bead stringing wire so that I can crimp it, and I know that it is a really secure connection. But in a different class. If I didn't want to talk about crimping and stringing, sure, using a different stringing material, maybe not so much silk, but a dandelion or a wildfire, something that doesn't stretch. And is waterproof, like those two materials are, would be a really, really good choice. You would just have to finish it off a little bit differently. And it would be, like I said, a totally different class. It would not be a bead stringing class or a bead stringing wire class. It would be a working with stringing materials. And in fact, you know what? I think that's not a bad idea for a class now that I'm thinking about it. I'll have to put that on the list. I'm always developing ideas for new classes. And quick aside, any thoughts that you all have for different classes? If you're like, you know what, Meredith, you did this class a while ago and I would love for you to revisit it in a different way. Or Meredith, you've never done this class. Please, I'm actually begging you, please put that in the comments. Because as instructors, it's always good to teach to what people want to learn, right? Okay, so we've got our bead stringing wire, and then the beads that I am using for class today, I've actually used them all up, but it's a strand. Oh, that's going to be a tough one. The number is 594064, and it's a strand of glass pearls, and it actually comes with, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 6 strands of pearls here. And I used 4 strands of those pearls for this long one that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times around. And I had enough left over for this one over here, which is my example that I'm going to be using today. So a good amount of pearls come on that skew. So definitely recommend. And then the hematite, they're called reconstituted hematite beads, or howlite reconstitute. And they're 8 millimeters. And the number there, if you can see, it's 242664, and there's a 10 that always precedes Michael's part. So it's actually 10242664. And Felicia is graciously and wonderfully putting the links to everything that I'm talking about in the comments. So much appreciated, Felicia. And then I had some leftover beads. These are just little spacer beads. And I have them listed in the instructions. They're just it's the part number is 10686705. Any little beads that you have left over will do. If you have some seed beads also, all I used those guys for was just right here on the very end in between that big hematite bead and my crimp cover. Whenever I am doing designing, I think 99% of the time, if I have a bigger bead with a bigger hole, I'm going to end with a little bit of a smaller bead with a smaller hole before I get to my crimp, both from a design perspective, but also it helps with the closing off of everything. Because why? Because sometimes your crimp tube, this is very practical, sometimes your crimp tube will slip down into a bead with a bigger hole. And I find that very annoying. And you can see how big the hole of that bead is. So my crimp tube is going to slide right down into there. That's not going to be a comfortable thing. So and that's why I do that, to make sure that crimp tube doesn't fall down in there. And then here, what I did, the way I finished this off, is I have a crimp cover here. Actually, so my crimp bead, my crimp tube, is underneath this crimp cover. Let me see if we can get that a little bit closer. That's not so bad. And then I have another bead before my wire guardian. So I like to play around with my finishings, and you'll see I have that little dangle do there. So you don't just need to do crimp bead class, call it a day. You can hide your crimp bead almost anywhere in your design if you want. But I sometimes like doing bead, crimp tube, bead. And if I'm feeling snazzy, I'll put a crimp cover on there. But I don't always use crimp covers. Personal preference, right? Okay, so let's see what else. We went over our beads. We went over our materials. We talked about, I've got wire guardians here, crimp beads, crimp covers. Let's the head pin, of course, if you want to do a dangle do. I actually made my own head pin here, but if you have head pins, you can use your own. And then, of course, you know, the regular run of the mill tools that we always need. We need a crimper tool, we need a nipper, we need a couple of chain nose and pliers in case we want to open some jump rings. And then the last thing that I have here on my materials list are bead stoppers. These guys are great. If you don't know what a bead stopper is, they're these little springy guys, and you just squeeze on the ends and you open up the spring just a little bit. You don't have to, like, you know, open it up so much, just a little bit, and slide it on, and then it holds your beads in place. So if you are walking around the room, if you're trying it on, if there's any way that fur baby might be involved in your life and likes to bat things around, this is a really, really good way to make sure that those beads don't go flying everywhere. Right. Let's make, right? We talked about all of our materials. We talked about our tools. We talked about our beads. Let's go and get making. Okay, so I have my wire and I am working off of the spool, and I went ahead and I strung up a couple of rounds of beads when Felicia and I were doing our talking beforehand. And like I mentioned, we're going to start with one of those hematite beads. And just a quick aside, if you don't, you can't find the hematite beads, maybe they just don't appeal to you, do this with a different set of beads. Do this with rounds, do this with rectangles, do this with gemstones. um you know, a design like this can be done in so many different ways. And before class, what I was doing while we were doing our introductions, I was actually grabbing a clasp, because maybe we want just a little bit more security on this. Maybe we have decided cool design, but a necklace, I'll never wear this as a necklace, right? This, even though it could be a necklace and it would be really, really pretty, with the kind of, it would be this kind of a design of an idea, right? It would come around and then the beads would come together down the décolletage. Or like I showed in the beginning, you could do it around like this and then kind of come down like that. I really like that as an idea for a necklace. That's why I didn't put a clasp on, because I think I'm going to wear this design just like this, doubled around kind of choker length, and it comes together with a diamond right here. Oops, a diamond right here, and then comes down like that. That's going to be nice and secure around my neck. I'm not going to have to worry about that. But after thinking about it a little bit, if I did want to wear it as a wrap bracelet, which I also really like that design, I think I might put a clasp on it. So let's just kind of get into it, do a little stringing, do a little crimping, and see where we go. Beth says she used a dark color cube and it turned out great. Oh, I wish that we could get pictures in that chat, because I would love to see a photo of that. Excuse me, you know what you could do, Beth? Go ahead over to the Jewelry Making with Beadalon Facebook group. And if you're not a member already, please go ahead and join. And then post a picture, because I would love to see that. Or you could post it on Instagram. And let me see if I can remember the hashtags. It is #LearnWithMichaels, #MakeItWithMichaels. And then, of course, please hashtag Beadalon and Meredith Joy Designs, MEREDITH, Joy Designs, so that everybody gets to see all of the things that you make. All right, so I'm running out of pearls, but we've got one. Oh, and Felicia just put the tags in the chat as well. But just for those who might be watching on the replay, as I'm stringing up my 7 pearls, I'll say we're doing Michael's classes now. That's a new one. I didn't know about that one. So Michael's classes is a hashtag. Make it with Michaels and learn with Michaels. Those are all of the tags that you can use on your socials to make sure that we can see what you make from the class designs. And we love to see what you make. All right, so let's see, 2, 4, 6, that's 7. And I'm going to take on one of the hematite beads. And I'm going to do 7 more of the pearls. And just as a quick aside, I talk a lot about finishing jewelry, but one of the things that we don't talk a lot about is how to get these pesky little guys onto the string. And I take it for granted that it's kind of intuitive, but let's just back up for a second. Got these 6mm pearls. My eyesight is not great not so great anymore these days. So what I do is I kind of roll it around in my hand until I can generally see where that hole is. Then I just let my wire kind of find the hole. It really wants to find the hole. I get a lot of kind of pushback because I do a lot of seed bead work. And I love seed beads. And people say, oh, how do you work with beads that are so small? How do you see the holes? And honestly, I don't always look for the holes. I just kind of find it generally. And then the wire will almost always find that hole if you just give it the opportunity. Lastly, I'm going to come here with that hematite, and I have run out of those pearls. So this is as much as I'm going to do for this necklace. And I think it's going to be enough that if I wanted to make it into a necklace, it would be enough. And if I wanted it to be a little bit of a wrap bracelet, it would be enough also. So let's go ahead and finish it off. And I think because it's a little bit shorter than this, I'm going to go through and do the exact same technique that I did here to end off this one strand necklace. But instead of doing my dangle do's here in my wire guardians, I'm going to add a clasp. Okay, so different ways of doing the same project. So I'm doing the ends the exact same way. Here, I'm going to do 1 bead, a crimp tube, another bead, a wire guardian. But rather than add my dangle do here, I'm going to add a clasp. So a little bit of a bonus, right? All right, so let's see. First things first, I'm going to grab my little spacers here, and I love these guys. I have so many little silver beads of various different finishes and origins, and I love the little silver beads or gold beads if I'm working with a warm palette for the ends of my design. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come on over and I'm going to add a crimp tube. Okay, so I'm using a number 2 crimp tube. And I know that because I'm looking at my wire and my wire tells me. I don't even have to think about it. I'm using this wire. I still have it connected, so I don't even have to worry about which wire it is that I'm using. And here I can know that I can use either, if I'm using crimp beads, a number 1, or if I'm using crimp tubes, a number 2. I tend to mostly gravitate toward crimp tubes. I find that they're easier to crimp. While I like the look of crimp beads a little bit better, I find for me, crimp tubes are easier to crimp. And that's what I recommend, especially if you are not as advanced or as experienced, I should say, of a beader. I'm going to put my little spacer bead on there again. And then I'm going to put on a wire guardian. I love wire guardians. They are these little horseshoe shaped guys. And they serve a couple of different purposes. One is design elements. Okay. So they in my opinion, make the end of your design look just a little bit more finished, a little bit more fancy, a little bit more sparkly. From a practical perspective, though, they make it, I'm going to show you really quickly how to do this guy. You're going to come up one end with your beading wire, around and back down the other end. And I'm going to wait? I'm going to wait and I'm going to attach my clasp with a jump ring. So what it also does is it helps you create the perfect amount of space in between your crimp tube and your clasp. So let me show you what I mean by that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take both of those wires, or I guess in this case, I'm just kind of tucking that tail back through that spacer bead and then back through my crimp tube. And I'm not worrying about anything that's happening down here right now. I'm just tightening everything up, tightening up that wire guardian. And I'm going to do a couple of things here before I move on. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to move my working tray out of the way and just try to get a little bit closer so that we can really see what's going on here. So we're going to give the camera a moment to adjust. I know it wants to. There we go. Perfect. Takes a little moment to adjust, kind of like me in any new situation, right? Okay, so we can see here, I'm really giving my camera a little run for its money. Many of the instructors are really having some frustrations in the video world right now because our new phone cameras aren't focusing as well close up as our old phone cameras did. I'm sure that many of you who watch a lot of our classes have heard many of us talking about it. Nobody's found a real good solution for it yet. Okay, so I've got my flat nose pliers, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and give a nice gentle squeeze to bring those two ends of the wire guardian gently together. So you don't want to do it so much that they get kind of jumbled up on each other, because that's happened to me before. You just want to do it enough so that they just come together, because if you keep them apart, they run the risk of snagging either on your skin and giving you a real uncomfortable sensation, or maybe on a fiber from a sweater or something. So I always just come in here and just give a gentle closure. The other thing that's happening here is you can see that little loop is coming up of the wire here. Let me get rid of it so you can see it. No loop. Loop. Here's where it becomes a little bit of a back and forth game, because since I am putting on a crimp cover, I need to make sure that there is enough space in between my crimp tube and that first little spacer bead so that I can put that crimp cover on and it's not going to get too crowded. It's a little bit of an art to this, a little bit of a finessing to this, a little bit of patience involved in this. But once you do it a couple times, you get the hang. So I'm going to actually leave that little loop here, because once I take up the space in between here, where's my awl? In between here with that crimp cover, that space is going to disappear like magic. Okay. So again, it takes a little bit of a finessing, and maybe it takes more than once, unfortunately. But now we're going to go ahead and crimp. So I'm going to use my crimping pliers. I know everybody knows this already, but I can't not explain it. We have our crimping pliers, and we want to make sure that we're using the crimping pliers that correspond to the right size crimp tube that we're using my standard pliers. And I'm going to come in the front of the pliers. You can see there are two little notches there. I'm going to use the front notch first, then the back notch, and then the front notch again. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to come in the front notch and to make sure that my wire is not crossed. I'm going to try to get a nice angle from the camera, and I'm going to give a gentle squeeze. Not a death grip squeeze, but just a gentle squeeze, just enough to turn that crimp tube into a little bit of an oval. Not a grand oval, just a little bit of an oval. And now I'm going to put that oval in the back jaw, the one that has the little nugget in it. And I'm going to squeeze down, and I'm going to turn that tube into a jelly bean. I move my camera up a little bit, so it's trouble. And turn that tube into a jelly bean. And now once I have that tube into a jelly bean, I am going to come back to the front. I'm going to put that jelly bean up and down. And I am going to round around in the front crimp so that I have a folded over jelly bean. Okay, I'm going to give a tug, make sure that nothing is loose, because that sometimes happens, right? We don't want that to happen. I don't need to do any more squeezing. My crimp is crimped. Next thing I'm going to do though is grab a crimp cover. Crimp covers have notoriously been one of my nemesis of mine, because they're a little bit challenging to put on. They can be fiddly. But again, patience is your friend. So I'm going to slide that crimp cover over my crimp tube and hold it in place. There are two tools that you can use to achieve this goal. And I alter, or I change which one I use on any given moment. But today I'm going to use my flat nose pliers, and I'm going to very gently and slowly move this around and squeeze those ends together so that my crimp tube, so that my crimp cover becomes a bead. Okay. And now we have a really nicely done. It's one of the better ones I've ever done. Crimp cover, mixing up my words. And you want that seam to come together nicely. And now we have it just looks like another bead there. No crimp tube in sight. So crimp covers can also cover up a variety of ills. And it looks like I did a pretty good job with guessing how much extra wire or extra room I needed, because that little loop that was there on the top of that wire guardian is gone. Susie's got a great tip about her crimpers. She said that she put washi tape on her mighty crimpers because she had had numerous tug fail tests with a number 2 crimp and realized that she was using the wrong crimp tool. A mighty crimper is going to make terrible, terrible things happen to a number 2 crimp tube. All right, so before I do that, I actually want to just tuck this tail in, and I leave about 1 inch of wire on the end. I find that that's kind of my sweet spot for comfort. And happily and luckily, that tail tucks in really nicely to all of these beads. If the tail didn't tuck into these beads, you could just snip it off and just tuck it through the hematite bead. One of the things that is always kind of a bummer is if your wire doesn't go through any of your beads, but it's not the end of the world, especially when you put a crimp cover on there. Just snip that tail off. It's not really serving any purpose except making us feel good. Okay, so here is where that tension becomes really important, because many times our inclination is here, and it's exactly what I just did. I tightened my beads all the way up so that there's no slack, so that everything is tight against the end here. But if I were to put this, see if I can grab another bead stopper just to show you what I mean. If I held that so tight and then tried to wrap this around my wrist, it's sticking out, right? I don't want it to stick out. I want it to lay down nicely. There's too much tension here. So I need to back this off and really build in. See how that fell down immediately when I took that tension off? And you can see what I meant about that 6 beads and then 7 beads being the perfect amount for me. With less and less tension in there, these beads are really going to behave, right? I'm kind of tapping it down and putting even more extra room in there. It still wants to go up just a little bit, which is why I'm thinking that for this design, since I only have 3 to go around, I'm just going to go ahead and put a clasp on. It's okay. If you want to do it without a clasp or with a clasp, but regardless what you want to do when you're closing any design up, that might be a little overkill. is put everything into a circle like this. Okay. That's how you're going to be able to build in the most amount of time, or I'm sorry, the least amount necessary. This is very important when you're using crystal beads, when you're using flat gemstone beads or flat any beads, when you're using anything that has sides that are longer sides that and flatter. Round beads have a lot more forgiveness to them. They have a lot more they're a lot more inclined to lay the right way. But once you start having rectangle beads, square beads, beads that have larger sides, this becomes an issue. And the reason why I harp on this so much is because at Beadalon, when we get calls or inquiries where somebody's necklace or their bracelet has broken, and we ask to see a photo, we kind of talk through the all of the reasons why it might have broken. 9 times out of 10, it's because it was strung too tight. So that is why you can, and you hear me talking about it ad nauseum sometimes. But it really is important. So I'm going to snip this off of the spool now, and I'm leaving about 5 inches. It's generous. I don't really need this much, but I find, especially when maybe if I'm just starting out, it's always better to have more wire to work with than less. It ends up wasting much less wire in the long term. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to string on that one hematite bead. And then I'm going to take on a crimp tube and another hematite bead. I'm sorry, I'm saying hematite bead, but I really mean spacer bead. I've been messing my words up all day. I was trying to talk to somebody about French wire earlier, and I kept calling it memory wire. And he was like, Meredith, what are you talking about? The memory wire does not go in little plastic containers. That I am saying memory wire, but I mean French wire. You knew what I meant. So it's just one of those days. You guys know how that is. So again, I'm using that wire guardian on the end of my design, up one end, around and back through. And the second end of our design is just the same as the first, but with a couple of exceptions. How's that for an explanation? Just the same, but a couple of exceptions. So I've gone through my wire guardian. I'm going to come back down through the spacer bead. I'm going to go back through my crimp tube, also my spacer bead. I'm going to come out here on my hematite bead. There, I got it right. And I'm not going to go through any more of the pearls. I'm just going to stop right there with going through the hematite bead. That is enough for me. And I'm tightening it up, but I'm not doing my final zhuzhes quite yet. Because before I do my final zhuzhes, I am going to once again come here with my wire guardian and my pliers, and I'm just going to gently squeeze those two ends together. Okay. Now this is where I really have to focus on that finishing. And I don't really need to worry about this end coming out. If I felt very strongly, I could put the wire guardian here if I thought that it was going to go flinging out. Sometimes I do that also to adjust the tension, to make sure I've got my tension right. But what I really want to do is put this around my wrist and kind of do a final check, see what's going on here. Okay, so what I've noticed is I've actually grossly misjudged the where this was going to finish. I thought when I had originally done this, that I had done it so that I had enough so that I could put the clasp on and then it would finish and I would have a 3-wrap bracelet. But somewhere along the line, that didn't work out, which is why this is my illustration for why it's always a good idea to check your work as you're going along. But luckily, it's still going to be long enough. I'm just going to pick it up and check it around my neck really quickly. Yep, we got a necklace. So all is not lost. So just be aware that if you do want to make it a multi-strand, I'm sorry, to make it multi-purpose, to be a bracelet and a necklace, you just want to go ahead and be sure to double check, like I did on this one, that it starts and ends in the same place. And I can actually even take this one and I don't even need to remove my dangle dues. I can make this. I can just throw a clasp on this and call it a day. I might do that. We'll see how much time we have. But I do want to come over here and finish this guy off. So let's talk wiggle room. Oops, sorry about that. I'm going to close this up. So I have built in the appropriate amount of wiggle room and tension, but I don't want it to be too much, right? You don't want big gaps of wire. You don't want it to be all floppy. So as you're designing your jewelry and as you're doing it over and over again, you kind of get a feel for how much room is too much room and how much room is not enough room. All right, so I'm going to back this off a little bit. And remember that loop that I created before, that's about right there. And this time I have to account not only for the wire, I'm sorry, for the crimp cover to come down here, but also on top. So I have to account for both places for that crimp cover. And that's where sometimes I get into trouble because I don't account for the space down here for my crimp cover to come on. So a good way of making sure you have that space is to put your fingernail there, especially if you have a thicker nail like I do. That's going to give you a really good amount of space. But now I lost that little loop up there. So I'm going to put that back in. And even though it's kind of it takes a while for me to explain and go over all of these things. Once you got the hang of it, it doesn't take nearly this long to get things finished. You just kind of do it and do it and do it, and then you're done. But when you're explaining it, you definitely want to make sure that all of the space that you need is accounted for. So I'm going to do that 3-step crimping process again, once in the front, once in the back, once back in the front, and then go around and around and around, and little chomping motion, little chomps around and around, and give it a nice tug to make sure that it didn't, that the crimp it took and it's holding. And I'm going to come out down here and I'm going to snip that wire off. So I've got a bracelet. So it'd actually be a great 3-strand bracelet with a clasp for someone with a much smaller wrist, or a 2-strand bracelet for someone with a larger wrist. I just did a little bit of misjudging when I was doing my counts initially. Or an anklet. Perfect. Problem solved. We've got an anklet, but let's go ahead and add a clasp just to finish off our jewelry class. So to add my clasp, I'm just going to take a couple of jump rings. It's the easiest way to attach things. I've got one jump ring here, one jump ring here. It's just a little variety pack of findings that we have at Beadalon. Any jump rings will do. These are 6mm, 4mm, or 5mm will do also. And I'm going to use 2 pliers to open my jump rings, 2 flat nose pliers to open my jump rings. I'm going to hold one on the side like that. And the other one, I'm just going to twist it open toward me. I'm going to put my half of my clasp in, and I'm going to add it to my design. And I'm going to do a little wiggle back and forth to close it up and make sure it's nicely closed. So the other reason why I like using wire guardians So I talked about how they put the perfect distance between your clasp and your wire. Sometimes people try to get this wire as tight as possible against the jump ring or the clasp, but that's going to put too much tension on the wire, leading to broken wires. It also helps to make sure that your distance is going to be the same on both sides. If you use a wire guardian on both sides, then your distance here is always going to be the same. Oh, you know what? I forgot to put my my crimp cover on. I'm going to do that over here. The other thing is it provides a little bit of extra abrasion resistance. It makes your wire a little stronger because you've got an extra guardian here against is when you use when you're using wire. I do not like to use a jump ring because the wire is so thin, it can very easily pull through the slit of the jump ring. Maybe you haven't closed it all the way. Maybe your jump ring is getting a little bit too much tension. But if you use a wire guardian, there's a lot less chance that you are going to have a problem with your wire slipping through. So those are all the reasons why I love using wire guardians. But let me go ahead and just slip this crimp cover on, oops, before I forget, since I already forgot once. The other tool that you can use, and I'm not as good at it as I tend to be, where is it? I don't know where my mighty crimping pliers went. We've got 3 standard crimping pliers and no mighty crimping pliers. But let's pretend that this is a mighty crimping pliers. It's not actually a mighty crimping pliers, but we're going to pretend. You can also use the rounded part of a mighty crimping pliers to close the crimp covers. I don't know where mine went. I must have brought it upstairs into my office for something. It's one of the challenges. I'm always bringing stuff from place to place, from room to room. And then, of course, when I need it at my hands, for whatever reason, it's not here. I'm just going around and around and making sure that that guy is closed. And once again, sometimes I get it. Sometimes I can mangle these guys beyond recognition, right? We've all been there, but not so bad today. Not so bad at all. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and add the second part of my clasp. Just opening up a jump ring. It's one of the fundamentals of jewelry making is good jump ring practice. And to close it, I always wiggle back and forth until I kind of hear a little bit of a click. And then I know that it's nice and secure. And so we're going to pretend that this is my ankle now. Anklets are very, very popular these days. So this is going to be my anklet for the summer. I'm excited about that. But if you loved the way that these little dangles look over here, very, very easy. All we need to do is grab a head pin of your choice, or you can make your own head pin. That is always an option, but this is what a head pin is. It's got this one happens to be a ball head pin. But all I did for this is my I have 2 more. My almost very last pearl. And then for a head pin, real quick, while I have a minute or 2 at the end of class, I'm going to use my round nose pliers, right? Not my flat nose pliers, but my round nose pliers that have round noses. I'm going to put those on top of that pearl. I'm going to push over at a 90-degree angle with my thumb. I'm going to move my pliers from being horizontal to being vertical. With my finger and my thumb, I'm going to pull that wire up and over the top down to whatever this angle is right here. Okay, then since my wire is around the top jaw of my pliers, I'm actually going to move my pliers so it's now around the bottom jaw. I'm going to switch hands. Okay, and I like to take this with my pliers and pull around toward myself. So now I have a really nice 90-degree angle here with my wires. And then again with my pliers, I'm going to push and I'm going to pull and I'm going to push and I'm going to pull. Okay. And so I have about 2.5 wraps on my head pin on my wrapped loop. And then I'm going to come in here and as close as I can, I'm going to snip that tail off. And then the last step is I'm going to come here and I'm going to tuck that tail in. That is the difference between a beginner and a not beginner, is whether or not you tuck those tails in. And then sometimes, then I like to give a little squeeze here just to make sure that loop is nice and in plane and in. I'm just kind of playing around with my camera. So interesting, my old camera. All right, I'm going to stop talking about it. And then if I want to add this as a dangle do, I come back to my trusty jump rings, which I have now put to the side. Up here, there. I'm going to add another jump ring, and I'm going to take a smaller jump ring this time. And open that jump ring up with my pliers. Add my dangle do. And then I'm just going to go ahead and add that dangle do to my wire guardian right by the clasp. I'm actually going to add it on the, I'm going to add it on the ring side. I think that'll make it easier to put on. And back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Now I have just an extra little something special there on my jewelry. So we covered a lot, as we always do in Michael's classes for the Michael's Community Classroom. You can go back ahead and rewatch this broadcast, this class, in about 24 to 48 hours on the Michael's Community Classroom YouTube, or portion of the Michael's YouTube channel. All of the links that oh, and Felicia just posted the link for the YouTube channel in the chat as well. Thank you guys all so much. Felicia, if you want, you can go ahead and take that overhead cameras or the upper camera so I can say goodbye to everyone. And thank you for participating and hanging out with me today. Definitely be sure to head on over to michaels.com and go and check out all of the classes across all different media that they offer. It's a wonderful thing that Michaels has made available for, gosh, what has it been, 4 years now, I think, with content and participation and community. And I know I have learned so many things from from many of the other amazing makers, and as well from the people who have participated in class. So much thanks to you. Much thanks to Felicia for doing an awesome job moderating, as always. Definitely be sure, if you have made the design today or any of your designs, post them on your socials and hashtag Make It With Michaels, Michaels Classes, Michaels Community Classroom, Beadalon, and Meredith Joy Designs. If you can remember all 5 of those things, or just one, we'll find your designs and we will definitely appreciate and like. So that's it for me for today. And until next time, happy beading.